I am really excited today's guest. I am a big fan. This is the first time we're chatting, and I'm really excited. I'm with the great Dana Bash. She's got a New York Times bestseller, very, very new New York Times bestseller, America's Deadliest Election, the Cautionary Tale, the most violent election in American history, which has frightening parallels to 2020 and hopefully not going forward. But it's about the 1872 Louisiana gubernatorial election. It's going to kind of blow your... I didn't know a lot about it, and it kind of blew me away. She is, of course, the co-anchor of State of the Union and the anchor of Inside Politics on CNN. She is a must-listen to, and thank you for taking the time. I know how busy you are.
Oh, my gosh. We have a mutual friend, Ali Zelenko, and I texted her this morning, and I said... Do you know what I'm the most excited about doing this week? And that is talking to Donny Deutsch. Seriously, I'm such a huge fan. I just think you are so wise, and obviously you know how to express yourself in such a way, and so many issues in such a way that I marvel at every day. So I'm very excited to be here. And
Mutual Admiration Society, you are both right down the middle, but also are able to do it with a little twist and a little humanity in there. I love the work you do, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
So we're going to spend a few minutes on current events, and we're going to spend most of the time on the book. We're going to sell a few books there because it's really an important book. But just fresh off the news yesterday, your interview with JD Vance, where he actually oddly admitted to creating the dog and cat story. He said, well, I think his exact words were, well, if I have to create this, otherwise the media won't carry it. What was your reaction? Of course, you had this look on your face that was like, did you actually just say that?
That's exactly what the look on my face was. Did you actually just say that? And, it's interesting that and you probably have a better understanding of how these things work and how things are perceived. And I learned this from, Anderson Cooper, and I don't think I've ever actually done it and when I say it, there's sometimes when there's a pause and a pregnant pause, my instinct is to fill that because it's like the viewer or the listener doesn't want to have this weird, awkward pause. But I restrained myself from jumping in when I, of course, had heard him say, I had to create a story. And I said, you created a story? And there was a pause. Now, in fairness, there could have been a pause because we talked over each other and perhaps he didn't hear me. But it sort of, I think, added to the of it all because he did say that. And it was a moment of clarity in an otherwise very, very, very confusing interview, and more importantly, a very confusing strategy that they have here. Actually, maybe it's not that confusing. It's pretty clear. They're trying to otherize. They're trying to come up with these baseless allegations, and then when you ask them about it, well, why are you asking me about this? It's just about immigration, and this is about the American media, and so it's hard to do it and not kind of follow down the rabbit hole. But I think in some not to have another animal pun, but in some cases it's important to kind of stay on it. And in this case, he was game. I was going to move on to other issues. And he said, no, let's talk this out. I said, okay.
The surprising thing is it was such a absurd, the way the media rightfully jumped on it when Trump said what he said at the debate. And the stunning thing is how these guys double down and triple down on it. That's the part that you just go, huh? And you go.
So let me ask you about that because you're obviously a sort of messaging and marketing genius, and so I want to know because this is the Roy Cohn.
Yes,
playbook.
You're never wrong. It's the Donald Trump playbook. You are
right, which he got from Roy Cohn.
Yes.
But is there ever a time where that backfires?
I think in this instance, it's interesting. If you go on the premise that right now, these people, they're playing to a few 100,000 voters. I mean, basically, everybody else is baked in. I still don't understand what makes an undecided voter at this point. But let's just say there is, if you add it up, there's 500,000, 600,000, 700,000. You say to yourself, those people obviously are not hardened MAGA people. So that kind of messaging, common sense tells you swings away. That the voters that are left undecided they may not be thrilled with the choice of Kamala, but they've been unsold or were never sold on Trump. how does this push them towards Trump? That's what I don't understand as a marketer, as a brander. I don't get I understand them not backing away from it, but not doubling and triple down on it, as opposed to like let it go away. It was one of his goofy things that he did. That's what I don't understand.
Yeah, and so it leads me to believe that because this is going to be an on the margins kind of thing, that maybe it's less of a I'm going to get that voter you just described, and more of a I'm going to make sure that my people get out. Exactly.
Yeah. I think there are 3 debates in history that have changed things, and one was in '60 and one was in '80, and certainly the one that you and Jake moderated. I remember watching at home, and about 90 seconds in going, we're not in Kansas anymore. I'm curious, get inside your head as you're sitting there, and clearly President Biden was not what there had been a lot of discussions about, how his fastball being gone and all of the other, but nobody knew to the extent. I'm just curious, thought bubble over your head as he was delivering and you're sitting there.
Same, just as yours was. And maybe even more so because I thought we got to keep this train on the tracks somehow. Not necessarily, certainly by that I don't mean
for him,
his job for him.
Yeah.
But like what's going to happen with this debate? And we had, just as we do before any debate, especially this one, we've done a lot of prepping. We do mocks. We have colleagues playing Trump, colleague playing Joe Biden, and for hours and hours we pretend. And this was like the one scenario that we did not plan for.
Yeah.
We were much more focused on Donald Trump and him not abiding by the mic rules, which the Biden campaign had put in place.
And you guys made a very conscious decision not to fact check. And your logic is, and I could give an hour argument on each side of that. Look, that's not our job. That's the other candidate's job. I'm just curious, what went into that decision?
What was that? That was kind of the primary motivation of staying out of it, and also going on precedent. You talk about 1960, that was the first televised debate. And really since then, there was one instance where there was a fact check and it didn't go well. And we just made a decision that we were, just as we didn't do in primary debates, because this is the first general election debate I've been involved in and that CNN has been involved in, because it was always the Presidential Debate Commission, which is now pretty much defunct. But even in the primary debates, we said it's up to the candidates, because if it's an interview, like you just discussed with JD Vance, then I'm it. I'm the person responsible for fact checking. A town hall, when it's you and the candidate and then voters who are there, you're the person in sort of the driver's seat. But we decided just to be traditional. And like you said, you can make an argument for an hour on either side of that. And ABC made a different choice. Yeah, they decided that clearly, and I was on it in their meetings, and I haven't talked to them since, but it seems as an observer that they made a decision that Donald Trump is a unique character in American politics, and he uniquely lies, and that even though Kamala Harris was clearly prepared to call him out on that, they thought that it was their job to do it as well. And like I said, you can make an argument for that also, but I do journalistically, it's keeping an even hand as much as you can. Yes. Understanding that you're not dealing with two of the same individuals who don't approach the truth in the same way is important, but very tricky. Very tricky. Speaking of truth and the untruths that Donald Trump tells, I'm curious. We were talking about this on Morning Joe the other morning. When he comes out the next day and says, I won the debate 84-6 or 93-7, just absurd. And you're not a psychiatrist, neither am I. Do you think that, and going back to the Roy Cohn thing, he says to himself, I know that's not true, but I'm going to do what I need to do? Or do you think he has a mechanism that makes it a truth in his head? And I actually think the latter is a possibility, as odd as that is. I don't know. I don't know. And
Yeah.
I'm not a psychiatrist, and I bet you most psychiatrists probably don't know
would
the
know.
answer to that. But I like positing the question and just thinking about it, because it's a really good question. I mean, if we ever get him and get him some truth serum, that's one question I'd like to ask him. Like, when you come up with these things, do you know that it's not true, or have you convinced yourself that
I think that's
true?
that's $1 million question. Let's get into the book. We'll come back. We'll talk a little politics. I want to talk about the book. What, you even admitted that you didn't know much about this. How did you
Nothing about it.
How did this come to you? How did you kind of stumble across this?
So Dan Abrams has written a lot of books with my co-author David Fisher, and they were looking for their next book. And Dan Abrams, actually, I just learned this, that he was reading the biography of President Grant, and this was just a small part of the larger Grant story. And he said, "Wait a minute, there was a contested election, multiple contested elections, and it ended in violence. Like, wow." So he brought it to David. They came up with the idea that maybe I would be somebody who, because of what I do on a daily basis, could be a good partner. And that's how it happened. And I literally, Donny, knew nothing. And I'm like embarrassed that I knew nothing about
this. It's the way I felt as I was doing my research on this and about the book. I was kind of like, huh? What? Wait, this went down? Talk to me. Just get the basics. This is 1872, or a few years after the abolition of slavery, and take us into Louisiana and what goes on there in the election.
Well, if you kind of go back 4 years before that, in 1868 was the first election that Louisiana had since they had their new constitution post-Civil War during Reconstruction. And it was the first time that freedmen, Black men, of course it was only men back then, could vote. And they did. And they came out, of course, they used this new right, and then some, and they elected people who looked like them, and they elected people, Republicans, because it was still the party of Lincoln.
Yes,
who promised.
That's also in reading it where I forgot.
Yeah,
I forgot which side. Yeah, I forgot which sides were which sides. Yeah.
And so, if you then go up to 1872, the Democrats, the segregationists, the racists, said, "Okay, we're not going to let that happen again," because they were still clinging to this notion that their society, that their white supremacy was going to somehow stay in effect in the South. And so they realized, having the experience of 1868, that the way to do it was to try to stop these Black voters from voting. And that's kind of the first time we really saw that happen. There was fraud, there was corruption, there was intimidation, there was threats and violence. And then there was
150 years ago. Sounds like yesterday.
Exactly. And there was actual violence. And
the Colfax massacre is one of the darkest days in our history.
Exactly. And just to sort of explain to your listeners that, what happened was, before the massacre, was that there was so much fraud, like whole ballot boxes being taken and shoved in the woods, and never mind that like actual voters who were supposed to vote were not allowed to vote, and then things that happened that were 10 times worse. Nobody would concede the election. So 2 governors, the opposing candidates, were inaugurated, I'm using air quotes, by their supporters. There were 2 legislatures that were sworn in, and it was total chaos. And as part of that chaos, the Democrats in particular were inciting violence. And they were saying to their supporters, get out there and do what you can to make sure that we stay in power. And in Grant Parish, named for President Grant, formerly General Grant, there was this Colfax massacre that you talked about. And there were 150 Black men who were slaughtered, cold blood. It was just awful. And in order to try to prosecute and find justice for them, the officials there put it in federal court, because they decided that we now have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments federally that were supposed to protect civil rights for these newly freed Black men. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that it's not up to the federal government, it's state law. It's up to the states to determine.
That's where Jim Crow came from, basically.
Yep. To determine election law and more importantly, civil rights. And that is exactly right. For the next 100 years, that's why the states in the South were allowed to implement these Jim Crow laws. And it all started in that 1872 election. And it basically just allowed the states to make it the law of the land.
It is amazing. It's not one of the things in history that people truly understand was a huge pivot point. Had it gone in another direction, our history.
I call it the sliding doors moment.
Yes, you actually do. It's what's also precursor is the vice president's role in what happened. Let's talk about that a little bit.
So then, if you fast forward again 4 more years to 1876, the problems never got resolved in Louisiana, really. I mean, they were kind of resolved who was governor and the legislature, but they never resolved the underlying corruption and so forth. And so it spread to other states. And by the time the election results got to Washington for the Electoral College to be certified, it was a mess. And there were 4 states, one of which was Louisiana, that set multiple slates of electors. And there was a huge discussion about whether or not the vice president, in his role as overseeing the certification of the Electoral College, could choose which slate of electors that that should be put in. And the decision was the VP did not have that role, that the VP's role was only ceremonial. Same decision that Mike Pence made 150 years later. And so that was something that had already been decided back then. And then there was another constitutional crisis because there were 4 states whose elections results were just thrown out. There was a tie in the Electoral College because of it. And they did what we do here in Washington, which is they came up with a commission. And it ended up coming down to one person who decided that it was the Republican who won, Rutherford B. Hayes. But because there's no free lunch, nothing is free, in exchange for that, the Democrats, with a wink and a nod, were able to get Hayes to agree, once he became president, to pull all the federal troops out of the South. So that was really the sort of the final nail in the coffin of Black Southerners having any protection. So a few years earlier, they no longer had the protections of the federal government when it came to their civil rights. And then with federal troops coming out, they no longer had the security of the federal government.
I mean, the intimidation that was going on, where there was every newspaper. I mean, it was, it really was January 6th in many, many ways, in the sense of this is not who we are. Well, obviously, worse are people. So this is not who we are. This is not a democracy. And it's very humbling. And what I think is so interesting for viewers out there or listeners to read this, you don't have to be a history buff. You have to be somebody that is basically concerned and follows what's going on in the world today to really look back and go, wow, the more things change, the more they stay the same in so many ways. And that's what's frightening about it. And I mean, voter suppression, racism, media manipulation, we've come a long way, baby, but have we?
Yeah. No, not really. And it took 100 years for the Jim Crow laws to be challenged by the civil rights activists of the 1950s and 60s, for the federal government. John F. Kennedy, I believe, was the first one to do it aggressively, to send federal troops back in to try to help the reintegration. And then, of course, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I talk in the book about the fact that one of my most searing, amazing memories of my life was walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis. Yeah. And again, I'm embarrassed that I didn't really know the origin of the Jim Crow laws that he almost died in order to get rid of on that bridge.
He got beat brutally. It's interesting. You talk about how that affected you, how listening to John McCain's concession speech affected you also. There's certain other moments. It is amazing I'm gonna sound like a cranky old man, but how these leaders that we had, they're not there anymore. The McCains and the Lewises. It is. I'm not saying there won't be new leaders, but there was a statesmanship and yes, they were partisan, but you knew they were there for the greater good. And it's getting harder and harder to find that today.
They're there. They're just drowned out.
Yeah.
They're drowned out by social media. They're drowned out. They're not welcome in their party. I mean, that's, I think, the biggest difference. There, you have a Liz Cheney who tries to be that person, and then she's kicked to the curb for daring to challenge Trump and Trumpism.
Do you feel? A lot of people think, well, maybe if the Republicans lose again, and theoretically it's their 7th straight loss, if you look at the midterms and if you look at, since they really haven't won an election since 2016, will that get them back a little bit more towards the center? Or this is the party now, like it was the party, even if Trump is gone, it's the party of Trump and there will be an heir apparent?
There's certainly Republicans who I talk to who quietly say that, even those who are publicly endorsing him, who quietly say if he loses, then they hope that the party will kind of wash him out of their system. I'm very dubious of that because of the media environment that we're in.
And the primary process. It's
the primary process first. I mean,
that's
foremost.
The 20% fringe votes, and there's your answer. I mean, it was interesting. I had Adam Kinzinger on last week, and I said to him, do any of the guys come up to you privately, guys or women, and say, Jesus, we know this is fucked up, and you do it. He goes, you would be shocked at the names I could give you. He goes, I could name 30 who would say to me, I wish we could do what you could do. Of course they could do it. They just don't want to lose their jobs.
They don't want to lose their jobs. And that's the other part of it. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I along those lines, I'm going to say something really sexist right now. I never understand as men how they go home and they look at their children, their daughters, their wives, their loved ones, and just as spineless toads, how they look themselves or their loved ones in the mirror when people know how they really feel. And how do you live your life that way? I come from a very different universe.
Well, unfortunately, the equality that we as women have achieved means that there are a lot of women who have to go home and look at their kids and grandchildren.
I know. I prefaced it by saying it was incredibly
No. But I'm saying, that's the thing is that it is it's much more universal in the GOP than we realize. And when I say it is like the disconnect between what they no doubt know in their gut and in their heart versus what they do. And that sort of brings me to the other thing I was going to say, that it's the primary process in electing a president, but it's also the gerrymandering in the House of Representatives. Because a big reason, if you go back to post January 6th, Kevin McCarthy went down to Mar-a-Lago and kissed the ring, was because the base of his party, who are the people who elect the Republicans in these ruby red states and ruby red districts, they were not done with Trump. They believed all of the things that he was saying. Mm-hmm. And so the only election that really mattered for most of his conference, the House Republican Conference, was a primary election. And I mean, look at Adam Kinzinger. You mentioned him. He's a perfect example. I mean, he was maybe in more of a swing area, but there are others who are even in more reliably red districts that they're not worried about being defeated by the Democrat across the aisle. That's like never going to happen because it's so red. They're worried about the challenge from the right.
Yeah. I'm worried on two fronts. I'm really worried if Donald Trump wins, and I'm really worried if Donald Trump loses. I want to start with the losing, in that, Rolling Stone did a great piece talking about the 70 county election officials who are heavy MAGA. And that basically if a county is not certified, it's going to be hard to certify the state. And I just don't think people are even going to how bad this can get if he loses. And to the point where I said this years ago on Chris Matthews' show, long before 2020, that that if he loses, he's going to tell people to take to the streets. I am so worried. I don't think people, as human nature, doesn't allow you to really go how bad it can be. And that's if he wins, and that's if he loses.
I agree. And the difference between now and 2020 is that there were still mechanisms
there were guardrails,
place and guardrails, even among Republican officials. And this is where you're going with this. In Arizona, in Georgia, these were Republican officials who said, no,
by the way,
we're not going to do this.
If 3 different people, our democracy is not where it is today. That's what I love when these people say, no, it can't happen. Do you know how close we were? Brad Raffensperger's not there. 2 other people are not there. Arizona, Georgia, we're in Bedlam land.
Well, let's just stay with Georgia for a second. So Brad Raffensperger is there, but the Georgia government changed legislature and signed by the governor, who is no Trump fan, but they changed the law ever so slightly. I mean, yes, we know about Larry David and the water and all that, but there are so many other changes, including what I think is maybe one of the biggest changes, which is the legislature gave itself power to throw out what Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, decides about how the election is certified. The Republican-controlled legislature, the very pro-Trump legislature, so that is the reality that we are heading into in the 2024 election, which is a difference between what happened before, which is that Brad Raffensperger could just, or Kemp or all the other people could just throw up their hands and say, well, this is the law in the state. The law in the state is different now.
Yeah. I also wonder when I talk to people and I say, if Donald Trump gets elected, things are really going to change. I mean, Project 2025, and you look at the way things, he wants the FCC to report to him. And I say to them, do you understand shows like the show that I'm on, Morning Joe, may not exist in its current form, where all of a sudden it's not hard to imagine Trump calling up the head of Comcast and saying, you might want to pull it back a little bit. I know you're trying to get these deals. And that's the smallest thing, down to free elections, down to, we know across the board. And they tilt their head and they go, nah, that can't happen. Not in this country. And it can happen. And we're so close to it happening. And why can't people take that in?
It's hard to wrap your mind around, because we're America and we're Americans, and we have taken for granted what we have for so long, which I guess is understandable because it's kind of all we know. But I like to think, and you're going to tell me I'm super naive, I'd like to think that there is that checks and balances do exist. Now, I will say that the Supreme Court is different than it was. Obviously, we know that. But I do think that there are some guardrails there. The question is whether or not members of Congress will choose to enforce them.
Well, we haven't seen that. Every indicator tells you when you think they're going to stand up, they won't. And when you also look at last time, he was surrounded by people like, Dina Powell and Gary Cohn and McMaster and Mattis and Kelly. It's going to be a very different group of characters there. I mean, that's the first question you have to answer to work at the RNC is, was the election stolen or not? And so you have built in just pure sycophantic loyalists. And so I'm not going to say you're super naive. You're hopeful.
I'm hopeful. I'm not naive. I'm hopeful because
I'd like to be hopeful also, but when I look at what's been going on since Donald Trump showed up and how we keep waiting for people to line up just on the side of basic what's right and wrong. And for the reasons we talked about earlier, they don't. This lust for power and this lust for keeping their job, and seeing how people have been, made outcasts, seeing what happened to Mitt Romney. And then you go, I don't know, is hopeful the right way to feel? I'm really worried. I'm worried that, I've said this before, that people like myself are on a list of several hundred people that, if you look, he plays by the autocrats playbook. And the autocrats playbook is, what do you do when you're in power? You take people who have been some of the loudest voices against you, make examples of them, and that quiets everybody up. And he makes he's
very open about it.
Tell you what they're going to do. He sat in the last debate and lauded Viktor Orban. And I was waiting for Kamala to say, oh, by the way, do you understand that that's no longer, Hungary is not a free country. It's not a democracy.
Yeah.
Like she never
He's
went
an
there.
autocrat.
Yeah, she never went there. She did a magnificent job otherwise, but there was certainly, with him, it's just a plethora of things that you can go after. And
You have to choose.
You have to choose.
I know.
Are you surprised he decided not to debate again?
No, but I mean, let's just say that like somehow the Harris people get Fox or some other more conservative leaning organization to agree to it. Do you think he's like dead set against it? I mean, I know he doesn't want to because he, in his heart of hearts, he feels embarrassed, but
he doesn't want to. Look, he's clearly transactional. If at a moment in time, bad example, he's down 7-8 points, and he's losing down 3 or 4 in the swing states, and it really looks like, and then he says, I need lightning in a bottle. I need somehow to catch her. I think other than that, his fear of, you said, of being embarrassed, knowing loss, and he doesn't want to put the work in. I had Scaramucci on last week. He said an interesting thing that was such an interesting little factoid, that Trump didn't touch down in Philadelphia until 6:57. Here he is, that'd be like you showing up for the debate you were moderating and landing in the city 2 hours before. That just shows you the lack of preparation, the lack of seriousness. And I think he just knows he's not going to put the work in.
Okay, let me give you another factoid, which is counter to that. Before our debate that day, it started at 9 p.m. He was in the hall prepping, and he was there for a while. By 6:30, he asked all the questions, Donny. He asked, like a TV person. Where's my camera? What does it look like? What's the light? Is anybody else in here? If I look over here, are they going to see me? He did it. He did all of the work. And you know who got there really late, and you can just see it?
Biden?
He didn't get there until it started at 9. He didn't get there until 8:40.
You're kidding me. Wow, no. That's the first time I heard that.
And then you can just, this, I'm not giving any state secrets because everybody saw the motorcade come in, just like
I never realized
Scaramucci was talking about and so Jake and I were supposed to be in our chairs to get ready at 8:35. We couldn't get in there.
Wow.
And because we didn't want to be, because we weren't there for when Trump did his walkthrough, and we didn't want to be there when Biden was for equity. And so there's a little.
You've had some really big gets. You obviously did the first interview with Kamala and Waltz. I thought she was very flat there. I thought you was a fair interview. I thought it was a good, fair, tough interview. But I was she overwhelmed me at the debate, and she underwhelmed me at your interview.
That's interesting. It was the first, and the debate, a speech, a rally. That's her comfort zone.
Yeah. Yeah.
The debate is like a courtroom for her, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And an interview is different. And it's, I think, always been maybe the forum that she has been least comfortable with. Mm-hmm. I don't really know why, because she's
very engaging when you meet her. Yeah. She's very charming. Yeah.
So I'm not really sure why. But it was also the first, and there was so much buildup to it because they waited so long.
Yeah.
So
shifting gears for a second, then we'll come back to the book. You have been very, I think, incredibly even-handed in your coverage of the war in Gaza. And candidly, many in the media have not. Early on, what was so astounding was how early on Israel was on the defense. They had been, we don't have to go and litigate the slaughter and the heinousness of it. And Israel was getting graded on a curve early on about how they reacted. And since things have shaped out. But I'm curious your take on the overall media coverage of the war in Gaza. It's a very loaded question. And I know you've got, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, you are. I think that Hamas is genius in its manipulation. I think that the fact that Gaza is too dangerous for most Western journalists to be there, and to be there without being embedded with the IDF, that Hamas, and with the backing of Iran and the understanding of Iran and how to manipulate. They are so evilly brilliant at putting out images, at putting out stats that we can't verify, at
I know we take the casualty numbers based by coming from them. I mean, the terrorists who are not even humans, and we are taking their numbers of casualties at face value.
So they are so manipulative of everything that people see coming out of there. And so it's that on top of the fact that there really are a horrible number of innocent Palestinian civilians who are dying. But somehow the fact that they are being run by terrorists who have all these tunnels, who not only don't protect them, take the humanitarian aid away from them, put them in harm's way. Yeah. Put them in harm's way, make them human shields. And so I think that is one of the biggest challenges in this war, with everybody using this. I'm holding up my phone. Everybody using their phone algorithms. So it's like you read, you watch something that is just horrific, and then the algorithm pushes that to you and pushes that to you, and then it's a combination of that plus what is being taught or not totally being taught in a fair way on college campuses, and the fact that Bibi Netanyahu has been in power for so long that young people who look at Israel think he and his approach is all Israelis. So it's sort of a stew of all of these things.
And then when you look at what's bringing up social media, TikTok, which is obviously Chinese run, and they want chaos here and they want upheaval. They basically, I think the algorithms for pro-Palestinian versus pro-Israel is 52-1 on TikTok, and that's where our young people are getting everything from, and that's it. It's frightening.
There you go. And so it is totally.
I'm so worried. I see a Rubik's Cube. I don't see how this thing plays out. If you said to me, okay, Donny, give me your best guess. Where do we go from here? I don't see it. I see complete fog.
Complete fog?
Yeah. I don't know how.
Well, it's hard. And the thing that concerns me the most is because of the algorithms and all of the things that we're talking about, and Hamas being so good at what they do, and Iran, who hates the regime, not the people, the regime of Iran, hates Israel, wants to blow them off the map. The way that the sort of meshing of being against the Israeli government, perhaps, and just raw anti-Semitism. I mean, the idea that sort of Zionism, if you say that you're anti-Zionist, if you know anything about the history of,
just means that you're anti-Israel existing. Zionist needs to be rebranded. It's very interesting. They've used the word Zionist.
I agree. So what's the brand then?
The brand is just Israel's right to exist.
But that's hard to say.
It's hard to say.
Too many words.
I agree with you, but that it is. Just yesterday, I don't know if you saw the story in Michigan, University of Michigan, a kid got, a bunch of kids asked another kid, are you Jewish? And he said, yes. And they put him to the ground and they kicked him and they spit on him. And this won't even be, if that happened to a person of color or an Hispanic, a Mexican, a gay person, this would be major news. And somehow anti-Semitism is put in a different container of but, and I don't know if it goes back to the oppressor.
It's because exactly that we just took the words out of my mouth. It's because it has somehow fallen into the oppressed versus the oppressor, because of some of the things that are happening on the West Bank.
Yes, which need to change.
Some of the things that have historically happened in Gaza. I'm not saying that there's no, that there aren't some problems, to put it mildly. But with the oppressor versus the oppressor in this case, allegedly being the Jews, you're forgetting like thousands and thousands of years of history of the Jews being oppressed.
Without, we only have to go back about 75 to something called the Holocaust, which was really. Let me ask you a question about other media figures. You're Tucker Carlson, who is obviously an educated guy. He has on not only a Holocaust denier, I don't want to call him a Holocaust, but basically blaming Churchill as the main villain in World War II versus Hitler. Do some of these media characters, are they just doing performance art and playing to their audience? Do they believe this? I'd love your analysis of this.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make it any less dangerous.
No, it's so dangerous. Let's go back to the book. So is there anything in the book that tells us, okay, we saw what happened in January of 2020. Maybe this is going to happen in January 2024. What do we look back and see and possibly put in our pocket to look forward?
I think it's some of what we were talking about, and this is what I'm looking at, which is the sort of shenanigans, which is of course the official political term of what happens when these votes are counted, which I'm not saying that there's going to be shenanigans with the votes being counted in particular.
It's going to be shenanigans about the votes being counted.
About the votes being counted and about those votes being certified and who does it and what their criteria are. Even to the point of where these ballot boxes are, which is going to be harder to find in some ways in Georgia. I mean, Georgia is actually backing up the early voting. They're expanding it, which is good. So there's more time, but there are going to be fewer places to actually physically do it. So I believe that is the kind of thing that that I will speak for myself, really want to focus on in a very aggressive way. And, there is also the question of how they act and react in Congress. Josh Gottheimer, who's a Democrat from New Jersey, he was just telling me, in fact, I'm going to have him on my show this week, that he and some of his Republican moderate brethren are starting a sort of resolution, a bipartisan resolution, to vow to certify the election results no matter what. Now, I don't know that a lot of people are going to sign on to that, but those moves are not nothing.
Yeah, they're not nothing. Any final thoughts about what you see the next 50 days looking like?
I mean, I'm just getting ready to expect the unexpected.
Yeah, I keep saying the same thing.
I mean, if you would have told me that Donald Trump would be talking about eating cats and dogs before 60 million people, I would have told you were, smoking or sniffing something. And here we go.
Along those lines, I always try and simplify this. When 80 million people in this country are going to vote for Donald Trump, give or take a minute, but I mean, win or lose, a big part of this country goes thumbs up. What is that? What is that?
A lot of different things.
Well, just give me
I think the biggest is money in people's pocket. I mean, yeah. I know some young people who, they voted in 2016, like they're just young enough or just old enough to have voted then, and they do remember Donald Trump as president and all the sort of drama and the chaos and the craziness. But what they remember most is that it was easier to pay rent.
Yeah.
It was easier to buy eggs and groceries. Now, what is a fundamental fact is that the economy is cyclical, and you know this better than I, and that it wasn't necessarily because it was Donald Trump's policies.
Right. And obviously the inflation is a result of both what Trump and Biden did to keep the world going.
Spending. Exactly. And so, but if you boil it all down to how people feel, that is a part of it. And that is a hold your nose in some cases. In some cases, they love him. They think he's funny. In other cases, maybe this is not the majority, but I cannot tell you how many Trump supporters I have met who genuinely believe that he was sent from God.
That's pretty frank.
So
I think a lot of it is what you mentioned, that throughout history, if you blame somebody's problems not on themselves, but either on a person of color or a media elite or a banker or any other, that's a very powerful message. And that's the essence. It's the essence of what Trump does. And the people that I get most upset about, and you and I both know a lot of these people, are the people that know better, and it's money in their pocket, but on a very different end of the economic spectrum. It's somebody who wants an extra 2% off their taxes, or a corporate, and those are the people that I get disappointed in, for lack of a better word.
And to be fair, there are also people who actually like his approach internationally.
Oh, by the way, Donald Trump,
maybe they believe in the madman theory, even.
Yeah, and by the way, there's a real logic to that. There's a real my logic goes the other direction, that I worry that the same guy that could say what he said about cats and dogs is capable of anything. And I had a discussion with somebody the other day. Are you okay with the guy whose hand on the button, who can say that, who will say that, who does say that? And we could list 1,000 other things, but you and I could go on for hours and hours and hours. The new New York Times best-selling book, America's Deadly Election, the Cautionary Tale, the most violent election in American history. Hopefully it will stay the most violent election in American history. Of course, Dan is also the co-anchor of State of the Union and the anchor of Inside Politics. I love your work. I was so happy you agreed to do this. I really was.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for having me on, and I look forward to seeing you IRL, as the kids say.
Everybody, thanks for watching. If you like it, hit that subscribe button. And we love having you here watching On Brand. And just don't miss any future episodes. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.